Soviet Union as an empire collapsed and major changes began for the countries that obtained independence and for Russia. So why this happened, if that was not driven by people?
It happened because the people on top wanted it to happen. Few people. I mean, who dissolved the Soviet Union? There were three people. The presidents of Russia, of Belarus and Ukraine. They didn't consult anybody. And there was no parliament to tell them to do it or not to do it. And the people just didn't care one way or the other. I mean, today when you read the public opinion polls, there's a certain amount of nostalgia for the Soviet Union. Maybe the nostalgia is because people were 20 years younger when the Soviet Union dissolved, and people have nostalgia for their youth. Maybe they feel a longing for Russia's might as a great world power, which it isn't today anymore. Maybe because it provided a certain amount of security, economic security. I don't know which it is. Maybe all these factors together. But at the time when it happened, there were no mass demonstrations in favor of maintaining the Soviet Union, were there? I mean, there were no objections, massive objections.
There were different, quite broad movements in different countries.
No, I'm talking about
some countries were calling for independence. In Russia, there were like huge protest actions, hundreds of thousands of people who just wanted change. They did not necessarily ask for the change or collapse of Soviet Union, but they were asking for change in general. Probably, as you would say, that happened just in the capitals, and that was just some percent of the population, but this percent of the population was...
Well, 10% in a country like that is a lot of people, of course, but it's still a minority. You know, in the United States, approximately half the people eligible to vote go and vote. In Russia, I think the proportion is much, much smaller. So in the United States, about 50% of the population, adult population, is involved in politics. In Russia, it's about 10%. And when you had the so-called coup of the generals and so on in August of 1991, how many people participated in that? 1,000 people were on the streets?
100,000.
No.
10,000, definitely. If just looking at the picture, you would
No, what's 10,000 people in a city like Moscow?
10,000 of people.
It's nothing.
I would say that it was 100,000. People who, you could just see it was crowded. Everything was crowded. You could just
in front of the White House, the population was very small. I mean, most people went about their business. If Russians cared about politics, you would have a different system of government in Russia than you're having.
Okay, why then Soviet Union collapsed? So you would say that there were no fundamentals behind that? There was no people who wanted that? So you would say that just happened by coincidence?
No, the many factors were involved in this. There was apathy. Nobody really cared very much. I traveled to the Soviet Union quite a lot. And I very rarely met people who, were gung-ho about the Soviet system. They were patriotic, they were nationalists, proud of being Russians and so on, victory of the Germans. But the system, in all the trips I took to Russia, I only met one man who really defended the system, and he was a member of the Supreme Soviet. I met him on a plane, and he defended it. Otherwise, they didn't care. And that's why when people like Yeltsin and his fellows in Ukraine and then Belarus presidents decided to resolve it, the reaction was very small, very unexciting.
So you would say that probably if this wouldn't happen that moment, because Yeltsin and the president of Ukraine and Belarus decided to do so, Soviet Union could have remained as a state formation?
My impression was it would have remained. Mm-hmm. I was surprised by the collapse. Mm-hmm. I thought that what you're going to have in Russia is very much what happened in China. That is, changing the economy, throwing the economy open to private business, because people were tired of the shortages and so on. But essentially the dictatorship of the party for another 10, 15 years. So I was caught by surprise by this. And the decision was made on top by a few people, and that was it. And there were no violent objections to it. There was no masses coming out on the streets saying, no, we want the Soviet Union. Now when I go to Russia, I see these pathetic old people walking with signs, maybe 20, 30 people walking saying, we want back the Soviet Union and this. But it's nothing, it's a pittance. And nobody pays attention to them. Russians are apolitical. And they have not been taught by centuries of political experience that politics matter. They don't see that it matters.
So you would say that all the changes, either in politics or economics, are driven by elites? Mainly by the elites, by political or economic elites.
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 Well, no question they're run by the elites. Yeah.
Just elites, so people...
By the 10%, yeah.
Okay.
The average Russian does not care what happens. The average Russian considers all politicians to be crooks. And not only in Russia, but everywhere, in America, in Europe, they're all crooks. They take power to enrich themselves. And how they rule and so on, they don't care, as long as they protect them from enemies, real or imaginary, abroad and at home. Other than that, they don't care. And their involvement in politics is very small. It took me many years to discover that. But it seems to me to be a key to the understanding of Russian political developments.
Господин Пайпс, а вот во времена, когда
Как что?
в те времена, когда вы работали для администрации президентов Рейгана и других, вы предполагали, что этот крах вообще будет и что он будет так быстро?
No, I did not. I thought the Soviet Union was much weaker than most of my colleagues did. Most of the so-called Sovietologists, I was not really a Sovietologist, I was a historian, but most of the Sovietologists believe the Soviet Union is very popular, the regime, and it's very stable and will last forever, which is why they said we have to get along with the Russians. And so on. I did not believe that. My trips, as I said, quite a few trips to the Soviet Union, and my conversations with people, casual and not casual, convinced me that the regime is not popular, that nobody really cares one way or the other. Sorry, it's the mail. But I did not believe that the regime is going to collapse. When I was in the White House under Reagan in 81, 82, I urged a very strong, defiant policy of the Soviet Union. I was not for détente, I was for confronting the Soviet Union, because I said the regime was not strong, it was weak and so on. But I did not expect a collapse like that overnight. So it caught me by surprise.
Но это было для вас действительно сюрпризом. А как вам кажется, не может ли и нынешний режим, который теперь установился в России, вот пойти по такому же сценарию, по такой же схеме, о чем многие у нас говорят, что может быть распад дальнейшей России сегодня?
It's possible, because as I say, the population at large doesn't have a real stake in this regime. If tomorrow a group of conspirators, and I've seen polls, by the way, where Russians were asked, what would you do if the communists staged a coup and seized power? So a good proportion said, I'll collaborate with them, I'll join them. Another group said, I'll collaborate with them. And a small minority said, I would emigrate. But very few said, I will resist. I'm saying 10% said, I will resist. So if that happened again, communists or fascists or what have you, I think you would not see much resistance.
Well, I have a completely different different perspective. I'm from Russia. I worked.
And what do you think?
I worked in Kirov region. It's a region.
Which region?
Kirov. It's named
Kirov, yeah.
Near Ural Mountain.
Yeah.
It's more that way, and I worked at the government there, and I had the chance to communicate with many people, have had projects with people even in villages, and I would say that the potential for participation of people in political life and even their awareness of political life, it's very much underestimated. So people are much more conscious, as they're taught to be. They probably like something that's quite dysfunctional, but they still have preferences, and these preferences do change over time. So
Well, you may be right. I don't know. I have my impressions. You have your impressions.
as during the communism, you would say, well, people were not, people did not care much, but the majority of people were aware that the regime is at least not what it pretends to be. Everybody was involved in some kind of social hypocrisy.
Of course, everybody was lying.
And everybody understood that, and so that's why everybody silently voted for this regime to go.
To end. Well, we have each other's opinion. You have your opinions, I have my opinions. Mine come. I first came to the Soviet Union in '57. It's probably before you were born.
Oh,
Certainly before you were born. And then I traveled in '59, '61, '62. I used to go there almost every couple of years. And I traveled all over the country, and I talked to a lot of people because I know Russian. And I carried away impressions that the regime, while it was not very popular, was not threatened by the population at large. And we know, I mean, the collapse of the Soviet regime was not caused by masses going to the streets and demanding collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, that did not happen. It happened because a few people on the top decided, beginning with Gorbachev and then ending with Yeltsin and others, decided the regime has to go, and with minimum public participation.
But were they not responding to some demand that was coming from? Okay, that's a large question.
Yeah.
Because I definitely, I'm just at this time I was just a child, but I remember that from the 80s. There were conversations all around in kitchens, like probably silently about what's going on, something is going to happen, something is going to happen. So when everybody is anxious about something that's going to happen, probably, then in the elite, in the power, grows demand for changes that Gorbachev tried to address, but
I don't have the feeling that Gorbachev responded to public pressure from below. I mean, I read his memoirs and so on. He traveled to Europe. He saw how society can be organized, and he was just discouraged by what you had in Russia and felt it has to change. I was once at a conference. It was in the Vatican. It was in the early '90s, and one of the participants was Alexander Yakovlev, who was a very close advisor of Gorbachev. And Yakovlev said that in 1988, I remember the year he said, we in the government decided that the communist system is unreformable. So it just has to go. There was a decision taken on top, not below. I don't think the majority of Russians would have concurred with that.
I have a question for you. Was there anything good, was there anything positive about Soviet Union?
Funny that you asked me this question. I attended in early 1990s the meeting of, what is the group called? In Switzerland, they meet, and there was the first time there was a group of Russians present. They rushed from the Soviet Union, and I asked them the same question, and there were about 6 or 8 Russians, and they huddled and they talked, and they said yes, one thing was good in Soviet Union: education.
Yes.
Was there anything good for the world coming from Soviet Union?
No.
Or from
No,
at all?
disaster, every way. I mean, the pact of Hitler brought on World War II and everything that came in its wake. And then they imposed their rule on Eastern Europe. Then they communicated communism to China, and millions of people perished. No. But education, I grant that. I mean, compared to what it was before the revolution, education was improved. But that's all they could come up with.
Господин Пайпс, скажите, пожалуйста, вот с вашей точки зрения, почему ряд реформ провалились, не получились в России? В чем вы видите какие-то причины этого? Это причина в экономике, в сознании людей?
You mean after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Yes.
No, which reforms do you have in mind? Какие реформы?
Я имею в виду реформа, например, собственности, когда исчезла государственная собственность, были переданы все в частную собственность. То есть элементы капитализма появились.
No, capitalism exists in the Soviet Union, in Russia today. There's no question. I mean, you walk around Moscow, and even in other towns. I was last year. I was in Perm, That's why you see it all over. Capitalism flourishes. What did not succeed is political reforms, and that I attribute to the lack of interest among the people at large, and rule of law. Russians don't respect law, and terrible things happen there. I mean, Khodorkovsky in jail is a crime. Man has done nothing wrong. He could have fled the country and been living it up as a billionaire in England or in Switzerland or whatever. And these things happen all the time. But economically, there's big changes occurred. Russia today is not enough changes. I mean, Russia is still a country that, like a third world country, lives mainly of sale of primary materials, not of manufactured materials. But still, there's no comparison going to Russia today what the standard of living is and what it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I would say not all the reforms failed.
Но многие у нас говорят, что реформы пошли несправедливо, что вот в странах бывшей советского блока, как, например, Польша, Венгрия, Чехия, да, сумели найти, особенно в Польше реформаторы, сумели найти модель, при которой вот этот раздел государственной собственности, он был все-таки под контролем закона и достаточно справедливым. И это то, что не удалось России, и то, что вызвало в массах населения такое неприятие вообще реформ, неприятие вообще капитализма.
Well, that's because Poland, it's the country I come from, has a tradition of liberty and rule of law. And even under the Soviet system and the communism, it was very different. I remember traveling in '75. I was for 2 months in the Soviet Union doing research, and I traveled to Poland for a week. A totally different atmosphere. So in Poland, the rule of law, respect for property are deeply entrenched. In Russia, they are not. You know, in Russia, private property in land, which was the main commodity, only came in at the end of the 18th century, under Catherine the Great. Until then, you could not own, you only could have land on condition you serve the state. Serfs did not have land, did not own anything. So